be kind of like the leading edge on that. We work closely with industry also, so the airline industry, the trucking industry, we're all looking at ways to reduce our consumption of fuels. And using alternative resources, specifically alternative fuels, I think benefits all of us. We have a demand signal out there saying, here's what we need. And we believe by partnering with industry, providing some seed capital to really move that forward will be the catalyst. And again, the Department of Defense is a very small consumer of fuel throughout the United States. But if we can send that small demand signal for these emerging technologies that we are willing to look at, as long as it's cost competitive, again, we're not going to buy fuel where it's not cost competitive, but where it's cost competitive, we are sending a signal that, yes, we would like to partner with you. We'd like to look at different ways of financing these projects to help move you forward. And we were there to procure it. Again, the Navy doesn't buy the fuel directly, so again, it's not the Department of Navy, it's DPA that goes out and purchases our fuel for us. But again, sending that signal to industry that do you have something available? And again, there's all these new technologies, emerging technologies that come to us and say we can be cost competitive. We have an RFP out there, as mentioned. We have 4 companies that we're looking at through negotiations, and we feel by 2016 that'll be the first step to get to where we need to be.
So my question is on the installation side. There's a whole slate of new regulations coming online soon for power plants. Carbon regulations being the kind of biggest animal in the room, but others as well that have a potential to impact power plants and the type of electricity available. I'm curious how that impacts you all, and I'm thinking particularly of the calculations around renewable energy, but you know, installations wide, how that affects your operations.
I think I'll take that one because it probably affects the Army more than any other services. So you're talking about the Boiler MAC rule and other type legislations. Yeah, it absolutely impacts us. We have a range of coal-fired boilers across the Army that provide, in many cases, process heat, in some cases, process electricity. And we are converting and replacing all of those over time. We have a plan to do that. And we, in fact, looked at this as an opportunity because the other thing that's come out of the Department of Energy, and the other thing which has come out of industry, is the promise of combined heat power. All right, so combined heat power solutions have, the costs have dropped, the scale has dropped, and we are going to replace boilers that range everywhere from $1 million to $126 million with combined heat power. And we have a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy. They're helping to analyze and assess that. And in some cases, we're able to do that through performance contracting. In other cases, we're using our working capital fund to do that. Implications of the Budget Control Act is that might be slower than we would have liked to have been otherwise. But we think this is an opportunity because, without going into the efficiency discussion, combined heat power plants operating off natural gas could reduce, in some cases, our carbon emissions substantially.
Jared.
Thanks, and thanks to you for putting this together. Dr. Geis, you told me before that maybe the hardest part of what you guys do isn't necessarily the technology, but more the green eye shade stuff, making sure the business deals pencil out just right. And then this thing called sequestration swoops in and sucks money out of every single pot of money in the department. I'd like to know from each of you, if you can, sort of to what extent that derailed any of the things that you're trying to do in the past fiscal year.
So certainly one of the choices we had to make in fiscal year 13, was addressing priorities for our sustainment, revitalization, modernization accounts. And there were projects that were on the list to be done that specifically related to energy that ended up being deferred because of the reduction in the funds that were available for those SRM projects. So I would say there is a real impact. And as you said, it's an across-the-board impact. So energy is not left out of that. It's not given a pass to say, okay, just because you're energy, you're not going to be impacted by sequestration. So the impact would be, in the long term, in particular on our installations, those projects that were not put in place, that we would not in the future be accruing the energy benefits, either efficiency or consumption reduction, that wouldn't be available count towards our goal of our intensity reduction.
Well, I think within the Navy last year, we were fortunate that with the first year of sequestration, we were able to, with the energy being a priority, the Secretary of the Navy, we were able to, I'll say, allocate enough money to cover our budget. I think as Dr. Gassi mentioned, though, as we look long-term, as we look through our fit-up, years 3, 4, and 5, if we go through a sequestration impact every year, of course energy will be impacted. There's no part of the Department of Defense budget that won't be. So we'd love to, yes, keep energy prioritized, but realistically we know that down the road, unless we see what those numbers are going to be, it's hard to say what the changes will be. So, but yes, energy will be affected long-term.
So, first of all, I just draw everyone's attention to the remarks that the Chief of Staff of the Army have made and the Secretary of the Army about how significant the impacts of the Budget Control Act will be upon Army readiness. All right, I would just refer you to those comments, and this is across-the-board readiness. It's readiness of our trained brigades, our soldiers, and our installations. So this past year, fiscal year 13, about $250 million, $250 million plus of energy projects were not executed in order to comply with the Budget Control Act. But what's even more significant for those of you in the energy management field, your best investment in energy is to maintain your current building and current plant. So with the SRM funds at below 50%, the existing Army facilities are breaking and they're not being repaired, and their energy performance is going down. And this represents a significant long-term cost liability to the country, because once they break, they're going to consume more energy and they're going to be more expensive to fix once we do get the funds. So the significant reduction in SRM accounts is going to create a financial hole that will have to be paid in future years.
Dr. Roth.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to ask about energy security. You mentioned it. I'd like to focus on the high-altitude EMP, electromagnetic pulse, solar storms, as a threat. Your equipment is out there, and it is under threat. Are you doing anything? I know that STRATCOM, department-wide, is looking at this. But is there anything going on in your activities to deal with those threats? But I'd also like to ask about non-nuclear electromagnetic pulse. In other words, an EMP generator that can go after a facility, an installation, or even out in the field, and just put that equipment out of ever working again. So is this part of your operation? And just to mention, there's military standard 188-125A, which is hardening equipment against this. Now that it has been shown to fail, is there anything going on to find ways to protect what's out there from non-nuclear EMP, also called IEMI?
So I'll start with answering part of that. And within the Department of Defense, we have a committee headed by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and American Security Affairs. And on that committee, it's specifically designed to address energy security issues. We also have members from the Department of Energy, Homeland Security, on some of the other agencies, but it's an interagency body that we host at the DoD, specifically to focus on energy security issues. I can't point to you a specific product that they've addressed, how they would solve that problem explicitly, but that is something that we're coordinating with, that OSD has a lead on. Energy security basically is having the power when and where you need it in sufficient amounts to do the job, and the ability to protect that and then recover from any disruption. So as we look at our energy program, energy security resiliency is a key component. It's not just having the power, but accepting that there are risks, or recognizing that there are risks, how can you recover from a disruption? You mentioned some types of disruption, but there could be many, many ways of disrupting. How do we address that on our installations as far as our master plans to look at how we can provide that power when we're needed to recover?
I think that was a good answer. I'll associate myself with Dr. Geis's answer.
Hi, Courtney Alvin from Inside the Air Force. Dr. Geis, you talked about, or you mentioned that the Air Force is looking at energy efficiency projects that maybe are more multi-dimensional and kind of relate to both usage and consumption and sustainment. And I wondered if you could talk in more detail about some of those opportunities and maybe some things that are currently in the works or might be early opportunities to do some of those things. And maybe those are things that are already kind of in practice now. But,
So probably the best answer is to amplify what I had mentioned a few minutes ago. And where we see probably the biggest opportunity is where we look at what airframes may be or may have viable options for engine replacement. Current engine technology could provide us with engines that have reduced energy consumption or increased energy efficiency, so that in order to perform the mission, it would require less energy. But also those engines, those designs are such that perhaps the engine never has to come off the wing again for the life of that aircraft because of the expected maintenance cycle for parts on those engines. I think part of the challenge is that if one made a proposition for an engine replacement project, that would be a very expensive proposition. I think the challenging fiscal environment that we have and where I believe we'll continue to have, that those large-scale projects will have a hard time competing, primarily because the payback would be over the life cycle of that aircraft, which could be an additional 20 or 30 years, and not have a return within the 5 years that folks want to look at. So we could have a good business case, yet the elements of that business case within the time frame that most folks are looking at, which is, say, 5 years, may not be able to return all of that investment. The other element of projects like that would be that most of the savings would probably come from the maintenance and sustainment side, not from the energy side, from the projects that we've looked at or the ideas that folks have had for projects like that. So it's not something that the energy lead would necessarily be carrying the flag for within the Air Force. It's probably whoever is responsible for the maintenance and sustainment costs for that particular aircraft would be the one carrying the flag, and we'd be alongside them saying, yeah, and energy gets a benefit from this too.
So gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for taking an hour out of your incredibly busy days to share with us, to brief us. We wish you all the best with your important work, and please join me again in thanking our guests.